Type Vince Russo in any wrestling comments section. The response is either complete silence or immediate rage. Jim Cornette has built a significant portion of his podcast around criticizing this man. Wrestling fans blame him for killing WCW. The internet wrestling community has spent 2 decades treating his name like a curse word. But here's a statistic that breaks the narrative. When Vince Russo became head writer, Monday Night Raw went from a 1.8 rating, near the lowest in the show's history, to regularly pulling 6.0s and higher. That's not opinion, that's data. That's more than 3 times the original rating. The wrestling community has spent 20 years scapegoating Russo for failures he didn't commit while ignoring the revolution he created. Picture 1996. The WWF is on life support. Vince McMahon is legitimately worried about the company's survival. WCW's Monday Nitro has demolished Raw in the ratings for 83 consecutive weeks. That's a year and a half of losing every single Monday night. The product was struggling badly. The main roster included Duke, the Dumpster, Drosy, a garbage man who wrestled with a trash can, the Goon, a hockey player in full pads, Mantor, a man in a bull costume. These were real characters on television. While WCW ran the New World Order storyline with Hall and Nash creating unpredictable television, the WWF was presenting wrestling like it was still 1987. The culture had evolved. Nirvana had happened. South Park was on television. Jerry Springer was drawing huge ratings. But WWF programming looked like a relic from the Hulkamania era that refused to update itself. Late 1996 brought Raw down to ratings that had the company losing millions. The WWF was in genuine financial trouble. Vince McMahon needed someone who understood where culture was going, not where it had been. He turned to Vince Russo, a writer for WWF magazine who had been critiquing the television product in his columns. McMahon promoted him to the creative team in '96 and made him head writer in '97. What happened next changed wrestling permanently. Russo's philosophy was straightforward but radical. Stop writing wrestling for wrestling fans. Start writing television for television audiences. This approach became known as Crash TV, named after its chaotic, high-energy style inspired by Jerry Springer, MTV, and the remote control generation. The changes were fundamental. Everyone on the roster suddenly needed a storyline. Before Russo, only the top 4 or 5 wrestlers had actual characters. Everyone else was generic filler doing squash matches. Russo insisted that even the third match on the card needed a reason to exist, a narrative hook that gave viewers a reason to stay tuned. Val Venus became an adult film star character with innuendo-laden promos. The Godfather ran a stable of female companions. D'Lo Brown had the chest protector storyline. Road Dogg and Billy Gunn weren't just tag wrestlers anymore. They were cocky characters with catchphrases that audiences repeated in school hallways and office break rooms. After Russo left, all these mid-card performers immediately vanished to Sunday Night Heat and lost their momentum, not because they couldn't wrestle, but because nobody knew how to write for them anymore. The difference was in the creative approach, the understanding that every minute of television needed a purpose. Russo mainstreamed the work shoot on a national level, taking what ECW had experimented with and Paul Heyman had pioneered and weaponizing it for a mass audience. These were promos where audiences genuinely couldn't tell what was real and what was scripted. Wrestling became unpredictable again, dangerous, must-see television, because you never knew when someone would break the fourth wall and shatter your expectations. The third shift was perhaps the most controversial. Moments began to matter more than matches. Critics say Russo hated wrestling, but that misses the point entirely. Russo understood that wrestling is a television show first, not an athletic competition. The distinction matters. September 27th, 1999 proved this thesis beyond any doubt. This Is Your Life segment featured The Rock and Mick Foley, some balloons, fake teachers, and pure comedy. 0 wrestling moves. It drew an 8.4 quarter-hour rating, making it the highest-rated segment in Monday Night Raw history. Not a match. A character-driven skit where 2 performers with incredible chemistry made audiences laugh and stay glued to their screens. Audiences weren't tuning in primarily for work rate. They were tuning in for characters they cared about, personalities they wanted to follow, and stories that made them feel something. Numbers reveal the complete picture, and they complicate the Vince McMahon was the real genius argument significantly. Here's the question that destroys the McMahon was the filter narrative. If Vince McMahon was this creative genius who just needed to filter chaotic ideas. Why was the product terrible from 1994 to 96 when McMahon was already filtering other writers? Why did questionable angles continue after Russo departed? Critics say Russo needed a filter, and that's true, but the data proves something equally important. Vince McMahon needed a spark. A filter with nothing creative to pour through, it just gives you empty air. They were codependent. Russo brought the edge, the modern voice, the understanding of 1990s culture. McMahon brought the structure and wrestling knowledge. Both components were necessary. Remove either one, and the Attitude Era doesn't happen in the form that saved the company. The Rock, the most successful crossover star in wrestling history, tweeted in 2019, "I had a great time working with that guy. I had some crazy out-of-box ideas and never once did he bat an eyelash, and we killed." When your biggest star credits you for their success, the narrative deserves serious reconsideration. The narrative that generates the most anger claims Vince Russo killed WCW. This is historically inaccurate. The actual timeline reveals a far different story. Russo joins WCW in October 1999. The company is already in crisis mode. The New World Order storyline has been exhausted and beaten into the ground. The main event is clogged with wrestlers like Hogan, Nash, and Savage, all holding creative control clauses that allow them to veto any storyline they dislike. Goldberg is refusing to work with certain people. Everyone has guaranteed contracts worth millions. Nobody wants to lose and hurt their mystique, and the backstage politics have spiraled completely out of control. What gets lost in the hatred is what happened in those first few weeks. The curiosity about what Russo would do with WCW was so high that ratings actually spiked initially. Nitro saw a noticeable bump as fans tuned in to see the Attitude Era architect try to fix a sinking ship. He immediately elevated the midcard, giving storylines to Booker T, the Luchadores, and the Filthy Animals. He attempted to build toward the future instead of remaining stuck in 1996 nostalgia. But the ratings didn't hold. The damage was already too deep. By late December and into 2000, the numbers had cratered again. The initial curiosity couldn't overcome the structural rot. The guaranteed contracts bleeding the company dry, the veterans refusing to put over younger talent, and the audience fatigue from years of mismanagement. So what actually killed WCW? The final executioner was Jamie Kellner. In 2000, AOL merged with Time Warner. The new executive team viewed wrestling as lowbrow content that didn't fit their upscale brand image. Jamie Kellner, the new Turner executive, decided wrestling was embarrassing and canceled all WCW programming. Here's what makes this crucial. The company was bleeding money, losing $62 million in the year 2000 due to terrible guaranteed contracts and mismanagement that predated Russo by years. While the financial losses were real, they weren't the reason Kellner pulled the plug. Even if WCW had turned a profit, Kellner wanted wrestling gone for cultural reasons. It didn't fit the brand he was building. Without television, Eric Bischoff's purchase attempt collapsed immediately. No network meant no value. Vince McMahon bought the entire company, its video library, its contracts, and its legacy for a fraction of what it had been worth just 3 years earlier. The point stands. Russo could have booked the greatest wrestling show in history in 2000, and Jamie Kellner still would have canceled it. Vince Russo was implementing serious women's wrestling almost a decade before WWE received mainstream credit for it. While WWE ran Diva Search contests and treated women's matches as intermissions, the Knockouts division was getting real television time. Gail Kim, Awesome Kong, and the Beautiful People were receiving main event segments, actual feuds with depth and character development. While agents like Scott D'Amore assembled the talent and scouted performers who could work, it was Russo as head writer who fought for their screen time and treated them like stars instead of novelties. Velvet Sky, one of the Knockouts, stated, "Vince Russo was always the #1 supporter of the girls and the Knockouts." The women's revolution that WWE gets praised for in 2015 was happening in TNA in 2007. But that doesn't fit the established narrative about Russo being a misogynist who only sexualized women, so it gets conveniently forgotten. TNA's ratings during this period tell their own story. In 2009, with Russo as a primary creative force, Impact averaged a 1.14 rating. This was the highest in company history, a genuine success for a startup promotion trying to compete with WWE's monopoly. Then Hulk Hogan and Eric Bischoff took over creative in 2010, marginalized Russo's style, and attempted to create a WWE-light product. By 2013, ratings had dropped to 0.99. The company's decline accelerated after Russo's influence diminished. The extent of irrational blame reached absurd levels in TNA. Mid-2000s, a segment airs that is so poorly received, the crowd chants, "Fire Russo!" Fans are furious. Social media erupts with anger. This proves Russo ruins everything. Except Russo didn't write that segment. Dutch Mantel wrote it. Both Mantel and TNA president Dixie Carter confirmed this publicly after the fact. Russo became such a convenient scapegoat that he received blame for everything bad in wrestling, even when he was provably uninvolved. His name became synonymous with bad booking, regardless of whether he was actually responsible. Russo had failures, absolutely. The Viagra on a pole match was poor, creative. Some of the swerves were excessive and confused audiences rather than intrigue them. The reverse battle royal was confusing at best and nonsensical at worst. But every booker in wrestling history has failures. Vince McMahon booked the gobbledygooker, Katie Vick, and the Lashley sisters angle. Paul Heyman booked the infamous crucifixion of the Sandman in ECW, a stunt so offensive it caused Kurt Angle to storm out of the building and nearly got the company banned from pay-per-view. Tony Khan has a habit of cooling off his hottest stars, killing the momentum of wrestlers like Wardlow with unexplained start and stop pushes. Every creative mind in professional wrestling has misfires. Bad ideas that seemed good in the writer's room but died on television. It's part of the creative process, in a medium where you're producing multiple hours of live content every single week. But only Russo's failures become defining memes of his entire legacy. Only his bad ideas get cataloged, repeated, and turned into shorthand for everything wrong with wrestling. Meanwhile, his genuine successes either get credited to other people or simply vanish from the historical record. Ask a casual wrestling fan what Russo did, and they'll mention David Arquette as champion and maybe the pole matches. Nothing else. Not the revolution, not the ratings, not the money, not the stars he helped create, just the failures. Vince Russo was one of the most effective television writers in professional wrestling history. Wrestling fans love to discuss drawing money and understanding the business. Well, Russo drew. The Attitude Era generated more revenue than any era in wrestling history before or since. His style connected with casual audiences in ways that traditional booking approaches struggle to replicate. History was rewritten to make him the ultimate scapegoat because it's simpler than acknowledging the complexity. It's easier to blame one loud guy from New York than to understand corporate mergers, guaranteed contracts, backstage politics, and the collaborative nature of wrestling creative. Vince Russo is loud. He's abrasive. He engages in public feuds that generate podcast content. He doesn't make it easy to defend him, and he probably doesn't care. But the evidence suggests that the person who wrote the highest-rated era in WWE history deserves more than being wrestling's eternal punching bag. Credit where credit is actually due. Recognition of genuine contributions that changed the industry, and perhaps some reconsideration from those who blamed him for things corporate executives, backstage politics, and other writers actually did. Sometimes the villain of the story was the hero all along. The data suggests this is one of those times.